The radio crackled with nothing but white noise as Sarah Martinez pressed the transmit button for the 15th time that morning. Her fingers were numb from the cold mountain air, and frustration gnawed at her stomach like hunger. She was supposed to check in with base camp every 2 hours, but the last successful transmission had been over 6 hours ago. Base camp, this is Research Team Alpha. Do you copy? Her voice echoed off the rocky walls of the narrow valley, where she and her 3 teammates had set up their weather monitoring station. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering above their heads. Dr. James Chen looked up from his laptop, where he was trying to compile their atmospheric pressure readings. His usually calm expression showed the first signs of worry. Still nothing. Sarah shook her head and adjusted the antenna one more time. They were part of a climate research expedition, studying unusual weather patterns in the remote Cascade Mountains. What was supposed to be a routine 3-day data collection mission was turning into something far more concerning. The equipment was working perfectly yesterday, muttered Tom Bradley, their technical specialist, as he checked the power connections for the 3rd time. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but even he couldn't hide his growing unease. All systems show green. The radio should be transmitting just fine. The 4th member of their team, Dr. Lisa Park, emerged from her tent where she had been analyzing soil samples. Any luck reaching anyone? She asked, though the expressions on her colleagues' faces already gave her the answer. Sarah tried different frequencies, switching between emergency channels and their designated research band. Each attempt met with the same result, static that seemed to mock their isolation. The mountains around them rose like silent guardians, their peaks disappearing into the low-hanging clouds that had rolled in during the night. We knew communication could be spotty up here, James said, trying to maintain his scientific objectivity. The terrain creates natural dead zones, and with this weather system moving in, he gestured toward the darkening sky where the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. But Sarah had studied these mountains for years. She knew their communication patterns, understood how the valleys and ridges affected radio waves. This felt different. This felt wrong. The complete absence of any signal, even distant chatter from other stations, suggested something more than just atmospheric interference. Tom pulled out their GPS unit and frowned at the display. That's odd. The GPS is having trouble getting a lock too. It keeps showing our position jumping around by several miles. The first crack of thunder rolled across the valley, and Lisa instinctively moved closer to the group. How long before we're supposed to check in again? We missed our last 2 scheduled contacts, Sarah admitted. Protocol says if we miss 3 consecutive check-ins, they'll initiate search procedures. James checked his watch. That gives us about 4 hours before they start looking for us. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain and something else, something that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. It was too quiet. Even with the approaching storm, there should have been bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But the forest around them seemed to be holding its breath. Maybe we should consider moving to higher ground, Tom suggested, packing up his tools. Get above some of this interference. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't convinced that would solve their problem. She had an uncomfortable feeling that whatever was blocking their communications wasn't natural weather interference. The static they were hearing had an almost rhythmic quality to it, like a heartbeat or breathing. As they began securing their equipment against the coming storm, Sarah made one more attempt to raise base camp. She climbed onto a large boulder that gave her a few extra feet of elevation and extended the antenna as high as she could reach. Mayday, Mayday. This is Research Team Alpha requesting immediate assistance. Our position is... She rattled off their coordinates, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. The static seemed to intensify for a moment, then suddenly cut to complete silence. Not even the background hiss that usually filled empty channels. Just absolute unnatural quiet. Then cutting through that silence like a knife came a single sharp crack. Not from their radio, but from somewhere in the hills above them. It sounded almost like a gunshot, but with a metallic quality that made it impossible to identify. All 4 researchers froze, looking up toward the sound. The mountains stared back at them, revealing nothing. What was that? Lisa whispered. Before anyone could answer, their radio suddenly burst to life with a cascade of voices speaking in what sounded like multiple languages, all talking at once. The cacophony lasted only seconds before cutting back to static. But in that brief moment, Sarah could have sworn she heard someone calling their names. The storm broke then, sending sheets of rain across their campsite and forcing them to take shelter. But as Sarah sat in her tent listening to the thunder roll across the peaks, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in those hills was listening back. And that single sharp crack they had heard wasn't random. It was a response. Their signal had died in static, but something had definitely heard them. The question that kept her awake as the storm raged outside was simple and terrifying. What was it that had answered from the hills above? The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the mountain air crisp and unusually clear. Sarah emerged from her tent to find the world transformed. Every surface sparkled with dewdrops, and the peaks around them stood out with startling clarity against the pale blue sky. But the beauty of the morning couldn't dispel the unease that had settled in her chest like a cold stone. Tom was already up, methodically checking their equipment. "Radio's still dead," he announced without looking up from the control panel. "But here's the strange part. Everything else is working perfectly. GPS locked on immediately this morning. Satellite phone is getting a strong signal. Even our internet connection is running fine." Sarah frowned as she tested the satellite phone. Sure enough, she had full bars and could access their research database without any problems. That doesn't make sense. If atmospheric conditions were blocking our radio yesterday, they should affect all our communications. Dr. Chen emerged from his tent looking like he hadn't slept well. "I've been thinking about those voices we heard. The multiple languages, the way they seem to overlap." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It reminded me of something I encountered during my time studying electromagnetic phenomena in Iceland." Lisa poured coffee from their camp stove and handed cups around. "What kind of phenomena?" "There are places where the geology creates natural amplification effects," James explained. "Certain mineral compositions in the rock can act like massive radio crystals, picking up signals from incredible distances and rebroadcasting them at different frequencies." Tom looked skeptical. "You're suggesting the mountains are acting like some kind of natural radio telescope?" "It would explain why we're picking up random transmissions while our own signals can't get through," James said. "The same geological features that amplify incoming signals might be creating a dead zone for outgoing transmissions." Sarah wasn't entirely convinced by the scientific explanation, but it was better than the alternatives her imagination had been suggesting. She tried the radio again, cycling through all available frequencies. Still nothing but static on their transmission band. Then she heard it again, that same sharp crack echoing from the hills above them. This time it came from a slightly different direction, somewhere to the northeast of their position. "There," she said, pointing toward the sound. "Did everyone hear that?" All four researchers looked in the direction she indicated. The mountainside appeared completely normal, steep slopes covered with pine trees, rocky outcroppings, and no sign of human activity. "Could be a tree falling," Tom suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Trees don't fall with that kind of regularity," Lisa observed. "This is the fourth time we've heard it since yesterday." Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm going to investigate." "That's not a good idea," James said immediately. "We should stick together and focus on re-establishing contact with base camp." But Sarah was already checking her day pack and pulling on her hiking boots. If there's someone else up there, they might have working communications equipment. At minimum, they could help us get word back to our team. The metallic crack sounded again, closer this time and definitely from the northeast. It was followed by what might have been an echo, but the sound had a different quality, almost like a response. "I'm going with you," Tom announced, shouldering his own pack. "If nothing else, we can get to higher ground and try the radio from a different position." James and Lisa exchanged glances. "We should all go," Lisa said finally. "Whatever's up there, we're better off facing it as a team." The hike up the mountainside was more challenging than it appeared from their campsite. The slope was steep and treacherous, with loose rocks that shifted underfoot and dense patches of undergrowth that snagged their clothing. But the higher they climbed, the clearer the air became, and with it came sounds they hadn't noticed before. There was definitely something moving in the forest above them. Not the random rustling of wildlife, but purposeful sounds, like someone walking carefully through the trees, trying not to be heard. Sarah called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? We're researchers and we need help with our communications equipment." The forest fell silent immediately. Even the birds stopped calling. Then from somewhere ahead of them came a voice. It was distant and distorted, but unmistakably human. The words were unclear, but the tone seemed questioning, almost cautious. "This way," Tom whispered, pointing toward where the voice had originated. They climbed for another 20 minutes before reaching a small clearing near the ridgeline. What they found there made all of them stop and stare in confusion. Someone had built a shelter, but not recently. The structure was clearly old, constructed from local materials with a skill that spoke of long experience living in the wilderness. Solar panels were arranged on the roof, and a complex array of antennas and wire stretched between the trees. But it was the person standing near the shelter who captured their attention. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, with long gray hair and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in years. His clothes were handmade but well-maintained, and his eyes held an intelligence that immediately commanded respect. "You're the ones who've been trying to transmit," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah found her voice first. "Yes, sir. We're climate researchers. Our radio went dead yesterday and we haven't been able to contact our base camp." The old man nodded slowly. "Radio doesn't work from down there. Hasn't for about 15 years now." 15 years? James stepped forward. "What happened 15 years ago?" The man studied them carefully as if deciding how much to reveal. "Military started testing something in the next valley over. Some kind of electronic warfare system. Creates a dead zone for most radio frequencies. But they don't know I'm up here, and they don't know I've been listening." He gestured toward his antenna array. "Took me years to figure out how to punch through their interference. Had to build everything from scratch, tune it to frequencies they're not blocking." Tom was examining the equipment with obvious admiration. "This is incredible work. You've essentially created a private communication network." "More than that," the old man said with a slight smile. "I've been monitoring everything they're doing down there. And yesterday, when you started transmitting, something got their attention. They've been jamming your frequency specifically since then." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Who are you?" The man was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the valley where their camp was barely visible far below. "Name's Marcus Webb. I used to work for the people who are now trying to keep you quiet. And I think they know you've found something they don't want you to report." The sharp metallic crack echoed again from somewhere nearby, and this time, Marcus smiled grimly. "That's my early warning system. They're coming up the mountain to find you." Marcus Webb moved with surprising speed for his age, quickly gathering equipment from his shelter while keeping one eye on the valley below. "How much do you know about why you're really here?" he asked Sarah as he stuffed electronics into a weathered backpack. "We're studying atmospheric pressure anomalies," she replied, confused by the urgency in his movements. "Climate change indicators in high-altitude environments." Marcus paused and looked at her with something that might have been pity. "And who exactly funded your research?" Dr. Chen answered before Sarah could respond. "The National Weather Service, in cooperation with the Department of Defense. It's a joint climate monitoring initiative." "Department of Defense," Marcus repeated, shaking his head. "They didn't send you here to study the weather. Dr. Chen, they sent you here to confirm what they already know, that their little experiment is affecting the local atmosphere in ways they didn't anticipate." The metallic crack sounded again, much closer now, and Marcus motioned for them to follow him away from the shelter. "We need to move. They've got about 20 minutes to reach this position, and you don't want to be here when they arrive." As they hurried through the forest, Marcus explained what he knew. He had been a communications specialist for a classified military project codenamed Silent Valley. The official purpose was to develop advanced electronic warfare capabilities, systems that could disrupt enemy communications while maintaining secure channels for friendly forces. But the real goal was something else entirely, he said as they navigated around a fallen tree. They were trying to create localized electromagnetic fields that could influence weather patterns. "Imagine being able to generate storms over enemy territory while keeping your own skies clear." Lisa struggled to keep up on the steep terrain. "That's impossible. The energy requirements alone would be astronomical." "Not if you know how to tap into natural geological features," Marcus replied. "These mountains sit on a unique mineral formation, a massive deposit of piezoelectric crystals that generate electrical fields when subjected to pressure. The military figured out how to amplify and direct those natural fields. Tom was nodding as the pieces fell into place. That would explain the communication dead zones. And if they're manipulating atmospheric pressure, they're creating the very anomalies you've been sent to document. Marcus finished. Your research isn't studying natural climate change. It's documenting the side effects of their weather manipulation experiments. Sarah felt sick as the implications sank in. They knew we'd find evidence of artificial weather manipulation. They wanted us to record it, but why? James asked. Why would they want documentation of their own illegal experiments? Marcus led them to a concealed observation post he had built into the rocky face of the mountain. Through carefully positioned mirrors, they could see down into the next valley, and what they saw made them all gasp. A massive installation sprawled across the valley floor, hidden from aerial observation by camouflage netting and natural-looking structures. Enormous dish antennas pointed skyward, while arrays of equipment hummed with barely contained energy. But most shocking of all were the clear signs of environmental damage radiating outward from the facility. The vegetation was withered for miles around the installation. The stream that should have run through the valley was completely dry, and the earth itself looked cracked and scarred. It was like looking at a wound in the landscape. They've been running this for 15 years, Marcus said quietly. And it's getting worse. The geological stress they're creating is affecting tectonic stability. I've recorded 3 small earthquakes in the past month alone. But why send us to document this? Sarah pressed. What do they gain? Marcus's expression was grim. Because something went wrong last week. Something big. Their weather manipulation system overloaded and created an electromagnetic pulse that knocked out communications across 3 states for 6 hours. The military brass is panicking because they know they can't cover this up much longer. He pointed to a section of the installation where emergency vehicles were still working. They need independent researchers to discover the natural explanation for the increasing atmospheric anomalies. Climate change, geological instability, solar activity, anything except the truth about what they've been doing here. But we'll report what we actually find, James said. Our research integrity. We'll get you all killed, Marcus interrupted bluntly. They've already decided you're a liability. Why do you think they jammed your communications? They're not planning to let you leave this mountain alive. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Tom was the first to break the silence. What do we do? Marcus pulled out a modified radio device unlike anything they had seen before. I've spent 15 years building a communication system they can't jam. We're going to broadcast the truth about this place to every major news outlet and scientific institution simultaneously. Will it work? Lisa asked. It has to, Marcus replied. But first we need to get closer to their installation. I need detailed recordings of their equipment, proof of the environmental damage, and most importantly, evidence of the seismic instability they're creating. Sarah looked down at the hidden facility and felt a mixture of fear and determination. How long do we have? Marcus checked his watch and then glanced at a small device that was beeping steadily. According to my motion sensors, the search team reached my shelter about 5 minutes ago. They'll figure out we're not there soon enough, but they'll have to search systematically. That gives us maybe 2 hours before they expand their search pattern to include this area. 2 hours to expose a 15-year-old conspiracy, Tom said with dark humor. No pressure. Actually, Marcus said, shouldering his equipment pack, we have one advantage they don't know about. That electromagnetic pulse last week didn't just knock out communications. It also damaged their early warning systems. For the first time since I've been watching them, their perimeter security has blind spots. As they prepared to descend toward the hidden installation, Sarah couldn't help but think about how quickly their simple research mission had transformed into something out of a spy thriller. But the evidence was undeniable. The withered landscape, the massive hidden facility, the systematic jamming of their communications. One more thing, Marcus said as they started down the mountainside. When we broadcast this information, they're going to try to discredit all of us. They'll claim I'm a delusional hermit, and that you're either conspirators or victims of my delusions. Are you prepared for that? Sarah looked at her 3 colleagues and saw her own determination reflected in their faces. We're scientists, she said simply. We follow the evidence wherever it leads. Marcus smiled for the first time since they had met him. Then let's go get them some evidence they'll never be able to explain away. The descent into the valley proved more treacherous than any of them had anticipated. Marcus led them along paths that seemed to exist only in his memory. routes that avoided the obvious approaches while staying hidden from the facility's remaining security cameras. Every few minutes he would stop and check a small handheld device, adjusting their course based on readings the others couldn't interpret. Motion sensors, he explained quietly when Tom asked about the device. I've mapped their entire security grid over the years. The pulse damage created gaps, but we still need to be careful. As they got closer to the installation, the evidence of environmental damage became impossible to ignore. Trees that should have been thriving in the mountain climate stood leafless and dying. The ground beneath their feet felt wrong somehow, too hard, too dry, as if the earth itself had been drained of life. Dr. Chen knelt to examine the soil, and his expression grew increasingly troubled. The mineral composition is completely altered, he whispered. It's like the crystalline structure of the rock has been fundamentally changed. That's exactly what's happened, Marcus confirmed. They're using the natural piezoelectric properties of the mountain, but they're pushing the system far beyond its sustainable limits. The geological stress is enormous. Sarah documented everything with her camera, taking careful shots of the dead vegetation and the strange mineral deposits that glittered unnaturally in the sunlight. But it was Lisa who made the most disturbing discovery. Look at this, she called softly from where she was examining a dried streambed. The others gathered around to see what appeared to be fossilized fish, but fish unlike any native to these mountains. They were larger than they should be, with bone structures that looked somehow wrong. Mutation, Marcus said grimly. The electromagnetic fields don't just affect the weather and geology. They're altering living tissue at the cellular level. They continued their approach until they reached the perimeter of the facility proper. From their concealed position behind a cluster of dead trees, they could see the installation in detail for the first time. It was far larger than it had appeared from Marcus's observation post, a sprawling complex of buildings, antenna arrays, and equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. But what caught their attention immediately were the emergency vehicles and the obvious signs of recent damage. Several of the larger antenna structures had been twisted into unrecognizable shapes, and scorch marks on the ground indicated where massive electrical discharges had occurred. The overload, Marcus explained. It happened right there. He pointed to what looked like ground zero of an explosion, where the earth had been turned to glass in a perfect circle nearly 50 feet across. Tom was studying the damaged equipment through binoculars. Those antennas weren't just bent by wind or earthquake. They looked like they were subjected to incredible electromagnetic stress. The system feedback on itself, Marcus said. They've been pushing these geological amplifiers harder and harder, trying to extend their range and power. But they didn't account for resonance effects. Sarah didn't pretend to understand all the technical details, but she could see the results clearly enough. How many people know about this place? Officially, maybe a dozen people in the Pentagon and a handful of scientists with security clearances so high they don't legally exist, Marcus replied. Unofficially, there are probably hundreds of people who work here, but they think they're working on different projects. Compartmentalized information. James was documenting the damaged landscape with his own equipment. We need to get closer. These photos won't be enough to prove what's really happening here. Marcus considered this for a long moment. There's a maintenance access point about 200 yards from here. The security camera covering that sector was knocked out in the overload, and they haven't repaired it yet. How do you know all this? Lisa asked. Marcus's smile was grim. Because I helped design their security system 15 years ago, and because I've been monitoring their repair schedules on their internal communications network. Moving closer to the facility required crossing open ground that left them feeling exposed and vulnerable. But Marcus's intelligence proved accurate. The security camera that should have been watching their approach was clearly disabled, its housing cracked and blackened by electrical damage. The maintenance access was a simple metal door built into what looked like a natural rock formation. Marcus produced a key card from his pocket, and Sarah stared at him in surprise. You kept your access card? I kept a lot of things when I left, he said, swiping the card through the reader, including detailed knowledge of their protocols and emergency procedures. The door clicked open, revealing a service tunnel that led directly into the heart of the facility. Emergency lighting cast an eerie red glow over concrete walls lined with cables and pipes. This feels like a very bad idea, Tom muttered as they followed Marcus into the tunnel. It is a very bad idea, Marcus agreed, but it's the only way to get the evidence we need. The tunnel led them past equipment rooms filled with humming machinery and control panels that displayed readings none of them could interpret. But it was when they reached an observation window overlooking the main laboratory that they truly understood the scope of what they were dealing with. The laboratory was enormous, filled with equipment that looked more like science fiction than real technology. At the center of the room stood what could only be described as a massive crystal formation. But this was no natural geological feature. The crystal had been artificially grown and shaped, its faceted surface glowing with internal energy that pulsed in rhythm with the facility's power systems. "They've created an artificial piezoelectric amplifier," James breathed, his face pressed against the observation window. The power output must be incredible, but it was Sarah who noticed the most disturbing detail. Around the base of the crystal formation, the floor was cracked and buckled, and those cracks were clearly recent. "It's destabilizing," she said. "Whatever they're doing, the system is breaking down." Marcus nodded grimly. The overload last week was just the beginning. According to their own internal reports, they're experiencing increasing system failures every day, but instead of shutting down, they're trying to push through with more power. Tom was recording everything with his camera when alarm klaxons suddenly began wailing throughout the facility. Emergency lights started flashing, and they could hear voices shouting orders somewhere in the complex above them. "What's happening?" Lisa asked. Marcus checked his monitoring device and his face went pale. "Seismic activity. The mountain is moving." As if to emphasize his words, a deep rumbling sound filled the tunnel around them, and dust began falling from the ceiling. The facility's equipment was screaming warnings, and through the observation window, they could see technicians running frantically around the glowing crystal formation. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said. "Now." But as they turned to leave, the lights in the tunnel suddenly went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, they could hear something that made their blood run cold, the sound of the mountain itself groaning under impossible stress. "The geological amplifiers are overloading again," Marcus said quietly, "and this time I don't think they're going to be able to shut it down." Emergency power kicked in moments later, bathing the tunnel in dim red light that made everything look like a scene from a nightmare. The rumbling beneath their feet was getting stronger, and Sarah could feel the walls of the tunnel vibrating around them. "Move," Marcus shouted, leading them back toward the maintenance access at a run. But before they could reach the exit, a thunderous crack echoed through the facility, followed by the unmistakable sound of massive structural failure. Through the observation window, they could see chaos erupting in the main laboratory. The artificial crystal formation was pulsing with unstable energy, sending arcs of electricity across the room. Technicians were evacuating in panic as equipment exploded in showers of sparks. "The resonance cascade is accelerating," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "The mountain's geological structure can't handle the stress anymore." James was documenting everything with his camera, even as they ran for their lives. "How bad is this going to get?" "Bad enough to register on seismographs across the continent," Marcus replied. "If that crystal formation goes critical, it could trigger a geological event that makes last week's overload look like a minor tremor." They reached the maintenance door, just as another massive vibration shook the entire facility. The electronic lock had failed, and Marcus had to manually override the system using knowledge that dated back to his time designing the place. "There," he said, as the door finally opened. "But we're not safe yet. We need to get to high ground before—" His words were cut off by a sound unlike anything any of them had ever heard. A deep, harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the mountain itself. It was as if the entire geological formation was singing, but the song was one of pain and imminent collapse. They emerged from the facility to find the sky above them crackling with unnatural electrical activity. Lightning was striking the mountain peaks repeatedly, but these weren't normal storm clouds. The air itself seemed to be charged with energy that made their hair stand on end and their skin tingle. "The electromagnetic field is destabilizing the entire atmosphere above us," Marcus explained as they ran across the damaged landscape. "We're about to witness something no human has ever seen before." Behind them, the facility was clearly in full emergency mode. Vehicles were streaming out of hidden entrances, evacuating personnel as quickly as possible. But Sarah noticed that they weren't all heading away from the mountain. Some were heading toward predetermined positions, as if this kind of disaster had been planned for. They knew this could happen, she realized. They have evacuation protocols. Of course they do, Marcus said grimly. They've been pushing this system to its limits for years. But they thought they could control it. The ground beneath their feet lurched suddenly, nearly throwing them all to the ground. When Sarah looked back toward the facility, she could see that several of the buildings had partially collapsed, and the main antenna array was sparking with uncontrolled electrical discharges. The crystal formation, Tom said, pointing toward the laboratory building. Look at the windows. Through the reinforced glass of the laboratory, they could see that the artificial crystal was now glowing so brightly, it was painful to look at directly. But more disturbing was the fact that cracks were spreading across its surface, and each crack released a burst of energy that made the entire building shake. When that thing goes critical, it's going to release all the energy it's been storing at once, Marcus said. The geological amplification effect will focus that energy directly into the mountain's fault lines. Lisa was struggling to keep up as they climbed toward higher ground. How much energy are we talking about? Enough to trigger landslides, avalanches, and possibly even volcanic activity, Marcus replied. These mountains haven't seen geological stress like this since they were formed millions of years ago. They reached Marcus's original observation post just as the mountain decided to demonstrate exactly what kind of power they were dealing with. The crystal formation in the laboratory finally reached critical mass, and the resulting explosion was visible even through the reinforced walls of the facility. A pillar of pure energy shot up from the laboratory, reaching hundreds of feet into the air before dispersing into the charged atmosphere above. The sound was indescribable, part explosion, part harmonic resonance, part primal scream from the earth itself. Then the real show began. The energy discharge triggered a cascade effect through the mountain's geological structure. Fault lines that had been stable for millennia suddenly shifted, releasing stress that had been building for 15 years of artificial manipulation. The ground heaved and buckled like water, and massive rock formations that had stood for eons cracked and tumbled into the valleys below. We need to broadcast this now, Sarah shouted over the noise, before the whole mountain comes down. Marcus was already setting up his communication equipment, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around them. I'm sending everything we've recorded to every major news outlet and scientific institution simultaneously. They won't be able to suppress this, but as he worked, they could see that the disaster was far from over. The electromagnetic pulse from the crystal's destruction was spreading outward in visible waves like ripples on a pond. Where those waves passed, electronic equipment failed, trees withered instantly, and the very air seemed to shimmer with unstable energy. It's not stopping, James said, his voice filled with horror. The energy release is feeding on itself. Marcus's equipment was the only electronic still functioning, protected by shielding he had built specifically to resist the facility's electromagnetic effects. Through his modified radio, they could hear emergency broadcasts from across the region as the pulse wave expanded outward. Multiple aircraft down in the Seattle area, one voice reported. Complete communication blackout across eastern Washington. Seismic activity registering 7.2 and climbing, another voice added. Evacuating all population centers within 200 miles. Sarah watched the expanding wave of destruction and felt sick with the realization of what they were witnessing. How many people are going to die because of this? Fewer than would have died if they'd succeeded in weaponizing this technology, Marcus said quietly. This disaster will end the program permanently, but first we need to survive it ourselves. The mountain lurched again, more violently this time, and they could see massive rock slides beginning on the slopes around them. Marcus's observation post, built into the solid rock face, was probably the safest place they could be, but even it wouldn't protect them if the entire mountain decided to come apart. Transmission complete, Marcus announced. The evidence is out there. Now it's up to the world to decide what to do with it. As if in response to his words, the electromagnetic chaos above them suddenly began to coalesce into something that looked almost like a massive storm cloud. But this cloud was shot through with colors that had no names, and the lightning that emerged from it struck the earth with impacts that felt like artillery shells. The atmosphere is trying to discharge the excess energy, Marcus explained, but there's too much of it. It's going to take hours, maybe days, for the system to stabilize. Tom was documenting everything with the last of his camera's battery power. At least we'll have a record of what really happened here. If any of us survive to share it, Lisa added quietly. The mountain gave another massive heave, and this time they could see that the entire facility below them was collapsing into a crater that seemed to be growing larger by the minute. The artificial crystal formation was gone, but the energy it had released was still wreaking havoc on the geological structure that had contained it for so long. Sarah looked at the destruction spreading outward from what had once been a secret military installation and realized they were witnessing the Earth's revenge against 15 years of abuse. The mountain had been turned into a weapon against its will, and now it was fighting back with a fury that defied human understanding. "How long do we wait here?" she asked Marcus, who was monitoring the seismic readings on his equipment. "Until the geological activity stabilizes enough for us to move safely," he replied. "Could be hours, could be days, but at least the evidence is out there now. Every major news organization in the world has copies of our documentation." The electromagnetic storm above them was beginning to show signs of organization, forming into spiral patterns that looked almost like a hurricane made of pure energy. But unlike a normal storm, this one was rooted directly in the Earth itself, drawing power from the geological chaos below. "Look," James said, pointing toward the horizon. "Aircraft." In the distance, they could see military helicopters approaching the disaster zone. But as they watched, the electromagnetic field surrounding the mountain began to affect the aircraft. The helicopters wavered in flight, their electronics clearly struggling against the massive interference. "They're going to crash if they come any closer," Tom observed. Marcus adjusted his radio and broadcast a warning on emergency frequencies. "All aircraft maintain distance from the Cascade Mountain disaster zone. Massive electromagnetic interference will disable your systems." 6 months later, Sarah Martinez sat in a congressional hearing room watching Marcus Webb explain to a panel of senators how 15 years of illegal weather manipulation experiments had nearly triggered a geological catastrophe that could have affected the entire Pacific Northwest. The hearing was being broadcast live on every major news network, and the story had become front-page news around the world. The official response had been swift once the evidence became impossible to ignore. The electromagnetic storm that followed the facility's destruction had been visible from space, and the seismic activity had registered on monitoring stations across 3 continents. Even more importantly, Marcus's broadcast had reached scientific institutions worldwide before any government agency could intercept it. The piezoelectric amplification system was designed to harness the mountain's natural geological energy, Marcus was explaining to the committee. But over 15 years of operation, the stress placed on the underlying rock formations exceeded all safety parameters. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward. "Mr. Webb, in your expert opinion, what would have happened if this system had continued operating?" Marcus didn't hesitate. Complete geological collapse. The mountain itself would have eventually suffered catastrophic structural failure, triggering landslides and seismic events that could have reached the magnitude of major earthquakes. Sarah glanced around the packed hearing room and saw faces that had become familiar over the months of investigation. Dr. Chen was scheduled to testify later about the environmental damage they had documented. Tom Bradley had already presented his technical analysis of the facility's equipment. Lisa Park had provided soil samples that showed radiation levels far above normal background readings, but it was the broader implications of their discovery that had captured the world's attention. The revelation that a secret military program had been manipulating weather patterns for over a decade had triggered investigations in dozens of countries. Similar facilities had been discovered in remote locations around the globe, and international treaties governing weather modification were being hastily drafted. "Dr. Martinez," Senator Williams called, and Sarah realized it was her turn to take the witness stand. "You were the team leader for the research expedition that uncovered this facility. In your own words, please tell the committee what you experienced." Sarah had told this story dozens of times now, to investigators, journalists, and government officials. But sitting in this formal hearing room with cameras recording every word for history, the weight of what they had discovered felt heavier than ever. "We went to the mountains to study atmospheric pressure anomalies," she began. "What we found was evidence of the largest unauthorized geoengineering project in human history." She walked the committee through their experience, from the initial communication failures to their discovery of Marcus's hidden observation post. She described the environmental devastation they had witnessed and the evidence of genetic mutation in local wildlife. The most disturbing aspect, she concluded, was the realization that our research mission had been planned specifically to document the side effects of this illegal program. We weren't studying natural climate change. We were unknowingly providing cover for weather manipulation experiments. The hearing continued for 3 days, with testimony from dozens of experts, government officials, and former military personnel who had worked on various aspects of the program. The picture that emerged was of a project that had grown far beyond its original scope, consuming massive resources while generating increasingly dangerous side effects. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the former director of the Silent Valley Project, was called to testify under immunity. Her testimony revealed the full scope of the program's ambitions. The goal was to develop weather modification capabilities that could be deployed anywhere in the world, she admitted reluctantly. We believed we could create localized weather events, storms, droughts, even fog banks, that would give American forces tactical advantages in any environment. And the environmental consequences? Senator Williams pressed, were deemed acceptable risks in the interest of national security, Hayes replied, though her voice lacked conviction. It was Marcus who provided the most damning testimony. His 15 years of documentation included recordings of internal communications, environmental monitoring data, and evidence of cover-up attempts when the project's side effects became impossible to ignore. They knew the system was unstable, he told the committee. The geological stress readings had been climbing steadily for 3 years before the final catastrophic failure. But instead of shutting down the program, they increased power levels and expanded operations. The political fallout was immediate and far-reaching. 3 cabinet-level officials resigned. The military officers responsible for oversight faced courts-martial. And international pressure mounted for comprehensive oversight of all geoengineering research. But for Sarah, the most meaningful outcome was the establishment of the Global Environmental Monitoring Initiative, an international organization dedicated to detecting and preventing unauthorized weather modification programs. She had been asked to serve as its first director. The technology isn't inherently evil, she explained to reporters after accepting the position. Weather modification could potentially help address climate change and prevent natural disasters. But it requires international oversight, environmental safeguards, and complete transparency. The mountain itself had become a symbol of both the dangers and the potential of geoengineering technology. The electromagnetic storm had permanently altered the local ecosystem, creating a unique environmental laboratory where scientists from around the world came to study the long-term effects of geological manipulation. Marcus had been offered positions with several universities and research institutions, but he chose to remain on the mountain. His hidden observation post had been expanded into a legitimate research station, and he served as its director while continuing to monitor the ongoing geological recovery. The mountain is healing, he told Sarah during her most recent visit to the site. The crystalline structures are slowly returning to their natural formations, and the electromagnetic anomalies are dissipating. But it will take decades for the ecosystem to fully recover. Tom Bradley had left climate research to work for the new International Oversight Organization, using his technical expertise to develop detection systems for unauthorized geoengineering activities. Dr. Chen had returned to his university but continued to study the environmental samples they had collected, publishing papers that had become foundational texts in the new field of geoengineering impact assessment. Lisa Park had perhaps made the most dramatic career change, leaving academic research to work as an investigative journalist, specializing in environmental cover-ups. Her reporting had uncovered 3 additional secret weather modification programs in other countries, the radio that had started it all, the equipment that had failed to transmit their routine check-ins and led to their discovery of the hidden facility, was now on display at the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit on scientific whistleblowing and environmental protection. But for Sarah, the most important legacy of their experience was the simple recognition that science without ethics was not science at all. The researchers who had worked on the Silent Valley Project had possessed brilliant technical skills and unlimited resources. What they had lacked was the moral courage to ask whether their work served the greater good. Standing in her new office overlooking the Potomac River, Sarah often thought about that morning when their signal had died in static. At the time, it had seemed like a simple equipment failure, but it had been the beginning of a chain of events that changed everything, not just for her small research team, but for the entire world's understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural environment. The mountain had answered their call for help, though not in any way they could have anticipated. Its response had been violent and destructive, but it had also been truthful in a way that no human institution had been willing to be. Sometimes the most important signals come not from our technology, but from the earth itself. And sometimes when we finally learn to listen, the message is one that changes everything.